Section 1. The Foundations of Athenian Democracy and Oligarchy. Development of Athenian democracy. Describe the evolution of Athenian democracy from the reforms of Solon, Cleisthenes, and Ephialtes, which established a system based on equal participation, public debate, and the role of citizens in decision-making. Athenian democracy emphasized popular sovereignty, where decisions were made by the assembly of male citizens, who had the right to vote on laws, policies, and military actions. Highlight how democratic reforms shifted power away from the aristocratic elite and toward ordinary citizens, creating a sense of shared responsibility and pride in the Athenian identity. Roots of oligarchic sentiment in Athens. Explain the foundation of oligarchic ideals, where power was concentrated in the hands of a wealthy and elite minority. The oligarchic faction believed that governance should be controlled by those with education, wealth, and experience, viewing democracy as chaotic and prone to mob rule. This sentiment was particularly strong among the aristocratic families who had traditionally held power in Athens and resented the rise of democratic institutions that reduced their influence. These elites argued that only the best citizens were fit to govern, opposing the principle of equal political participation. Section 2. Tensions and clashes during the Peloponnesian War. Democratic faction, expansionism, and popular sovereignty. The democratic faction, led by figures like Pericles, pursued an expansionist policy during the Peloponnesian War, seeking to spread Athenian influence and protect its empire. The Democrats saw the war as a way to assert Athenian power, maintain control over the Delian League, and secure resources. Describe how the democratic system allowed influential orators to sway public opinion in the assembly, which sometimes led to risky decisions, such as the ill-fated Sicilian expedition. The democratic faction's support for imperialism reflected their confidence in Athens' ability to project power, even at the cost of prolonged warfare. Oligarchic faction, opposition to war and fear of mob rule. The oligarchic faction was generally more conservative and often criticized the Democrats' aggressive foreign policy, arguing that Athens should focus on stability rather than expansion. Oligarchs believed that Athens should avoid conflicts that drained resources and disrupted social order. Oligarchic leaders warned against the influence of demagogues, who, in their view, manipulated the assembly for personal gain. They were skeptical of the masses making strategic decisions, viewing the democratic process as vulnerable to impulsive choices that endangered the state. Section 3. Key episodes of democratic and oligarchic conflict. The revolution of 411 BC and the oligarchic coup. In 411 BC, following a series of military setbacks in the Peloponnesian War, the oligarchic faction seized control of Athens, establishing the Council of the 400 in an attempt to replace the democratic government with an oligarchy. The coup was partly influenced by fear of defeat and a desire to establish a more stable government less prone to populist pressures. Describe how the oligarchs promised more efficient governance and an end to the costly war, but their rule quickly proved unpopular. The council's repressive policies and exclusion of ordinary citizens sparked resentment, and within months, the democratic faction managed to restore the democracy, demonstrating the resilience of democratic ideals among Athenian citizens. The rule of the 30 tyrants, 404 to 403 BC. After Athens' defeat in the Peloponnesian War, Sparta imposed an oligarchic regime, known as the 30 tyrants, led by Critias, an extreme oligarch. This regime executed political enemies, confiscated property, and ruled through fear, aiming to suppress any remnants of democratic sentiment. The brutality of the 30 tyrants alienated many Athenians, sparking resistance led by democratic exiles. In 403 BC, democratic forces managed to overthrow the oligarchic government and restore democracy once again, illustrating the enduring appeal of democratic principles even after military defeat and oligarchic repression. Section 4. The influence of external powers on internal politics. Spartan support for oligarchic factions. Discuss how Sparta, with its own oligarchic system, often supported Athenian oligarchs, seeing them as more aligned with Spartan interests. During the Peloponnesian War, Sparta provided backing for oligarchic takeovers in Athens, hoping to weaken Athenian democracy and gain control over the city. The alliance between Athenian oligarchs and Sparta reflected the broader ideological divide in Greece, where oligarchic and democratic factions often aligned with external powers that matched their political ideals. This external influence deepened internal divisions, as each faction sought foreign allies to support their respective agendas. Persian influence on Athenian factions. Persia also played a role in Athenian factionalism, funding both oligarchic and democratic factions at different times to keep the Greek states divided and unable to unify against Persia. The Persian Empire's shifting alliances demonstrated how external powers exploited Athenian factionalism for their own strategic interests. The dependence on Persian support revealed the vulnerabilities within Athenian politics, as both factions were willing to seek foreign aid to achieve their goals, further entrenching political division and weakening Athens' autonomy. The rivalry between democratic and oligarchic factions in Athens was a defining feature of its political landscape, particularly during the turbulent years of the Peloponnesian War. While Athens became known as a bastion of democracy, internal conflicts between those who championed popular sovereignty and those who believed in rule by the elite revealed deep divisions. These struggles shaped Athens' political actions, influenced its wartime strategy, and contributed to the city's instability. This essay explores how the democratic and oligarchic factions vied for control in Athens, influenced by external powers, and examines the impact of these internal conflicts on Athens' history. Section 1. The Foundations of Athenian Democracy and Oligarchy. Development of Athenian democracy. Athenian democracy evolved through reforms aimed at breaking the monopoly of power held by the aristocracy. Leaders such as Solon, Cleisthenes, and Ephialtes played pivotal roles in redistributing power to the assembly and encouraging broader citizen participation in governance. The assembly became the central institution where male citizens could vote on laws, military campaigns, and policy decisions, establishing a government rooted in the principle of popular sovereignty. This system of democracy encouraged pride in Athenian identity and fostered a sense of shared responsibility among its citizens. However, the empowerment of ordinary citizens also threatened the traditional power of wealthy families, leading to tensions between those who supported full democratic inclusion and those who preferred a return to oligarchic control. Roots of oligarchic sentiment in Athens. In contrast, the oligarchic faction believed that governance should remain in the hands of the experienced and educated elite. These leaders argued that the masses were too easily swayed by emotions and demagogues, which made them susceptible to poor decision-making. The oligarchs viewed democracy as chaotic and volatile, fearing that popular rule could lead to instability. This sentiment was especially strong among old aristocratic families who resented the rise of democratic institutions. Many oligarchs believed that only the best citizens, those with wealth, education, and military experience, were fit to govern. They were deeply skeptical of the democratic model, fearing that it would erode traditional values and lead to reckless decision-making. Section 2. Tensions and clashes during the Peloponnesian War. Democratic faction, expansionism, and popular sovereignty. The democratic faction, led by figures like Pericles, supported an expansionist policy during the Peloponnesian War, believing in the power of Athens' empire to secure resources and spread democratic ideals. They saw the war as an opportunity to solidify Athenian influence in the Greek world, with the assembly often supporting ambitious policies aimed at extending the city's reach. The democratic process in Athens, however, was susceptible to the influence of powerful orators. Leaders like Alcibiades persuaded the assembly to approve risky endeavors such as the Sicilian expedition, which ultimately resulted in disastrous losses. The democratic faction's drive for expansion reflected confidence in Athenian power, but also revealed the pitfalls of decision-making based on public opinion rather than strategic prudence. Oligarchic faction, opposition to war and fear of mob rule. In contrast, the oligarchic faction opposed Athens' imperial ambitions, advocating instead for cautious policies and internal stability. Oligarchs criticized the influence of demagogues and were wary of the popular assembly's tendency toward impulsive decisions. They viewed democracy's emphasis on public debate as a weakness, fearing that it opened the door to manipulative rhetoric and hasty actions. The oligarchs' resistance to expansionist policies revealed their belief in preserving the traditional Athenian way of life and avoiding unnecessary wars. As the war dragged on and Athens faced mounting losses, the oligarchic faction gained support from those who began to see the drawbacks of democratic expansionism. Section 3: Key episodes of democratic and oligarchic conflict. The revolution of 411 BC and the oligarchic coup. After a series of setbacks in the Peloponnesian War, including the failure of the Sicilian expedition, the oligarchic